In this video, I'm going to answer a question live. It comes from November 2020. You can find it from this webpage to follow along if you want. If not, check it out on screen. So there are some key things which are true of every single question 4. The first thing you want to notice is you're always pointed to a particular section, and if you quote from anything outside that section, it won't earn you marks. So it's really worthwhile going to the extract and highlighting the area you need for the question. So line 24, here's my source, and I'm just going to get a highlighter pen and I'm just going to put a highlight down the side here so that I know what bits to answer from. As you know, you always get a statement and your job is going to be to evaluate it. That word will always appear in the second bullet point, and evaluate to me means that you have to have more than one perspective. Now, what's helpful is the question will give you more than one perspective. Let's have a look at it. I wasn't at all surprised by the disappearance of the stranger child at the end of the extract. The writer has left us in no doubt that she is just part of Rosie's imagination. So there are two parts to this. Is the stranger child part of Rosie's imagination? And the second part is, should there be any doubt about that? So it's an evaluation question, so obviously I'm going to argue that there should be some doubt. Interestingly, I totally disagree with this student's view that this is part of Rosie's imagination. That didn't even occur to me at all. I thought this was definitely a character who was going to turn out to be a ghost. Now, whether I'm right or whether I'm wrong is irrelevant, though I will check at the end of this video to find out. Your job is to make sure you deal with both parts of the argument in your answer. So let's zoom into the right lines. A little girl was sitting back on her heels beside a clump of daisies that grew against the fence. Nothing there. She had her back to Rosie and was holding tight to the handle of a large wicker basket that stood on the ground beside her. Well, it seems quite real, but still no evidence really. Cara seemed unfazed by the girl's presence and continued to move, engrossed along the row of plants. Okay, that's my first bit of evidence. Cara is Rosie's daughter. She hasn't noticed this girl, or at least hasn't reacted to her, so that might indicate she isn't in fact there. Our first hint that the stranger child might not be real is Cara's reaction, appearing both engrossed and unfazed by the girl's presence. However, it may simply be that Cara is absorbed in her task and simply hasn't noticed a real child. Notice that I've included the word however really early in my answer because that tells the examiner I'm evaluating. And it also reminds me that I have to look at more than one view about this child. Is she imaginary or not? We now go back to the extract. Rosie bent forward to look through the clearest of the panes and peered closer. Well, I could use that, to show that the panes are obscured and therefore it might not be real, but it's not strong evidence, so I'm going to leave that. The child was small, maybe around 8 or 9, although something in the tense hunch of her shoulders made her seem older. Her hair hung down her back in a matted, dusty-looking plait, and she was wearing dressing-up clothes, an ankle-length dress, and a pinafore in washed-out greys and tans, like a homemade Cinderella costume. Well, that is an extraordinary amount of detail, isn't it, for someone who's just not quite sure what they're seeing? So I'm going to use this as evidence that the picture of this child is very clear in Rosie's mind, and this therefore suggests it's a real child that she's seeing, or at least it's not part of her imagination. There is a possibility that the child is real. This is conveyed through the long, complex list describing her. The adjectives matted, dusty looking, and ankle length all suggest that this child is a very visible presence. Further details in this list indicate strong links with the past. For example, the ankle length of the dress, the wearing of a pinafore over the dress, and the simile that these clothes look like a homemade Cinderella costume also feels antiquated. These clues are probably intended to suggest that the stranger child is not imaginary, but actually a ghost visiting from the building's past when it was a silk factory. Let's look at some of the features of this paragraph. So I've highlighted my methods here, so the use of adjectives and the simile. I should also have highlighted the long complex list. That's also a method the writer's using. Let's look at the word possibility and probably. These all show that I'm exploring different interpretations, which means I'm evaluating and getting into the top mark band. So now we go back to the extract, and I have to bear in mind my time limits. So I'm at line 33 here, and I've just got to go to there. If you're running out of time, then you need to jump towards the ending, but I'm not running out of time, so I'm going to keep going chronologically through the passage. Where on earth had she come from? She must be a neighbour's child, but how had she got in? The wooden fences that separated the gardens between each of the houses in the terraces were high, surely too high for a child to climb. So this is evidence that it's impossible that it's a real child. So I'm going to quote that, but I'm also going to use that to say it's not necessarily her imagination. It could be supernatural. And the other clue to it being supernatural is this. Where on earth had she come from? She has not come from Earth. She is supernatural. Okay, so I'm going there. A further clue that the child might not be real is the height of the fence around the garden. Surely too high for a child to climb. However, this does not necessarily indicate she is an imaginary child. The telling question Rosie asks herself is, where on earth had she come from? This invites us to suppose that the child is not an earthly presence and is consequently a supernatural one. She may well be a ghost. You will notice I haven't included any rubbish about nouns or adjectives here. I've chosen a method which is this, the telling question that Rosie asks herself. That's a method the writer is using. She's making Rosie ask that question in order to make us suppose that maybe it's a ghost. So methods doesn't necessarily mean literary techniques. I've included the word adjectives here because that was part of a pattern. The writer is deliberately using these adjectives to create an impression. But if I'm writing just about a single adjective, then it's pointless saying that it's an adjective, like who cares? It could equally be a noun or a verb. It's just a word. But if there's a pattern of the way words are used, then I'm going to list that as a technique. Once more, if you're running out of time, you're going to jump to the ending. I'm not running out of time, so I'm going to move through chronologically. The child glanced over her shoulder back towards the houses, a quick, furtive movement, as if she was scanning the upper windows of the row, afraid of being overlooked. So this again is really telling detail in another list, which suggests that actually it's not an imaginary child. But I've already mentioned a list, so I'm not going to put this into my answer unless I have to. Rosie caught a glimpse of her face, pale and drawn with anxiety, before the girl turned back and reached forward to quickly tuck a piece of trailing white cloth into the basket. At the beginning of the extract, we were told that in the present day, they're living in a disused silk factory, so we know this reference to the trailing cloth implies that this girl is holding some silk, which again suggests that she's a ghost visiting from the past. This is a bit complex and I'll only use the detail if I need it. In the end, I decide I won't. Almost unconsciously, Rosie registered that the girl was left-handed like herself and that there was something animal-like in her movements, quick like the darting of a mouse or the flit of a sparrow, some small dun creature that moves fast to blend into the background. So I know the examiner wants me to write about this because there's a simile in it, like the darting of a mouse or the flit of a sparrow. And it's obviously a method that I can write about. So I could argue that this also reveals it's part of Rosie's imagination to see her as like an animal. That's not really a very realistic portrayal of a child. So I can take that route, or I can take the route that the details are so compelling that this would be too much to imagine on the spot. The description that the child is animal-like and the simile that she moves like the darting of a mouse or the flit of a sparrow does make the stranger child seem unrealistic, and this could indicate that she is an imaginary figure. However, the simile might simply imply the trauma that this child has been through, which is perhaps the driving force that causes her supernatural presence. After all, the garden is not full of ghosts, but just contains this particular one, who we imagine must have a particular reason for appearing. Let's examine what's going on in my paragraph here. So I'm listing the methods again: description, simile and simile. I'm also using this language of evaluation, looking at more than one possibility. However, might and perhaps. I've also highlighted this quotation for you. The word trauma doesn't appear in our lines 24 onwards. It came earlier in the extract, but including this one-word quotation is vital to backing up my interpretation, and it's only one word, so it's not going to take up too much room in my essay if the examiner thinks, oh, I'm not going to credit that. I think they will. Now, this bit I've highlighted down here, I've included because I know similar text to this, and therefore I know it would be a convention that the ghost appears because there's a particular reason. There's going to be a connection to the characters in the book. Now, you don't have to include that to get the marks. The examiners won't expect you to make this leap of logic here, okay? But because I'm an expert reader, after all, I'm an English teacher, I've included that because I recognise that this is a convention. But to repeat, you wouldn't have had to have spotted that to get top grades. Now, whatever the question, I know with 100% certainty I have to write about the ending. The examiners will have spent a lot of time trying to find an extract where the ending was significant. So let's read it and see how it helps us with this question. Something wasn't right here. She had seen distress in those eyes. Well, that could prove that it's imaginary or a ghost, so it's not helping me yet. Rosie turned away, dried her hands hurriedly and slipped on her flip-flops. She would go gently, raise no challenge about her being in the garden, but say hello and try to find out what was the matter. So I would want to use that as evidence that this isn't an imaginary child. Why would she be trying to find out what was wrong with this particular child who was distressed, rather than paying attention to her own children? It doesn't really feel psychologically right. Why would she ignore her own kids? Maybe if she pointed out that her mother would be worrying where she was, she could persuade the girl to let her take her home. So again, this is the maternal instinct. Why would she waste that on an imaginary figure instead of her own kids? So that's evidence for me that it's not imaginary. Then we have this final paragraph, which is just one sentence long. There's a structural feature. The examiner's going to want me to write about this line, that's for sure. But when she stepped outside, the child was gone. So that's what I'm going to lead with, I think. And it links back to the idea that Rosie was moving hurriedly, and so there wasn't really any time for the child to disappear. Well, that doesn't indicate whether it's imaginary or a ghost, does it? So then I'm going to go back to the detail about the distress and the motherly instinct and say that actually proves Rosie wouldn't waste her time worrying about an imaginary figure when she's got her own kids to worry about. The extract ends with a single sentence paragraph, intended to dramatise that the child is not real. Despite Rosie moving hurriedly and therefore getting to the garden very quickly, the child has gone. This feels impossible because the writer has deliberately placed the detail that the fence was too high to climb earlier in the extract. Although this might suggest that the child was indeed imaginary, the writer has been careful to point us in a different direction with another short sentence. Something wasn't right here. The vague something invites us to infer her sense of unease, which matches the idea of a supernatural presence. Rosie also focuses on the distress in the child's eyes, which again refers to the ghost's reason for appearing. It also implies that Rosie is acting out of maternal instinct and would not waste this on an imaginary figure when her own children would so clearly need her, as we are supposed to infer from the earlier trauma referenced in the passage. Consequently, we can conclude that there is no doubt the child is not real, because it would be impossible for it to appear and disappear within this garden. However, there are enough historical clues to suggest that the child is a realistic portrayal of a figure from the past, and therefore is probably a ghost. Let's go through the important features of this part of my answer. The extract ends with a single sentence paragraph. That is a method. And the writer has deliberately placed the detail about the fence. That again is a method. It's not a literary technique, but it's what the writer's doing in order to make us answer this question: is the child real? She's placed it earlier in the extract. Then in green, I've got my words which show us I'm being exploratory, I'm evaluating, I'm looking at more than one point of view. Although, might, consequently, however, and therefore. You'll notice that my conclusion is full of those words because it's a way to sum up not just my point of view, but to remind the examiner that I have been evaluating all the way through. So even if I haven't used these words anywhere else, I'm definitely going to look at them in my conclusion, and I'm always going to start my conclusion with the word consequently. Let's jump back to some more methods. Here I have a short sentence again. The writer's been deliberately vague about what's going wrong here, and therefore being vague is a method that the writer's using. The writer wants us to notice the distress in the child's eyes, so she focuses on the distress. That is a method. The writer mentions the trauma earlier, and therefore placing it earlier in the text is a method. I'm making a point of this because most students seem to think that methods are only literary techniques like simile, metaphor, personification, alliteration, but a method is anything a writer does. Let's just check I haven't made all this up. This is the mark scheme, so to get the top marks, yes, you have to write about the methods. Let's check it out. The use of the simile, like a homemade Cinderella costume, undercuts Rosie's attempted rational explanations and places the girl within the genre of the fairy tale, signalling to the reader that we should not trust what Rosie is seeing. So this examiner has decided that simile is a method, but look at this. The writer includes so many clues, so that is also a method. And there we have clues referenced again down here, again coming back to that method. So I said I would check out this book and see if I was right, and here we are. Beulah is the young girl in the story, and she comes from 1812. Fairy story, my arse, examiner. Ghost story, supernatural. Now, if you would like to know how to answer question 3, check out the video appearing here. Don't forget to subscribe, ring the bell, ding-a-ling-a-ling, get all the videos you need.